online
Okay, hey everybody. Today we're going to be going more into detail into some of the steps that you have to go through to preparing an oral presentation. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about gathering material and then organizing the presentation, which are steps 3 and 4, if you remember from the last clip. So first, a little bit about gathering material. What is this? Gathering material is finding the information, is thinking about what are the details, what are the things that you're putting into your presentation. This includes brainstorming or just thinking about what do I know about this topic? What do I want to include? What are the important things that need to be a part of this presentation that I already know? What directions do I want to go? This also includes mind mapping. That means writing everything down. You just put a piece of paper down there and you think of all of the details and how they connect to each other. You draw lines from one subtopic to the next subtopic, just thinking of all of the things that you could include. It also includes research. So part of the gathering material phase is, what don't I know? I already know these things, but what questions do I have? And then going to find the answers to those using internet, using reference material to figure out what extra details, what extra things that you want to put into your presentation that you don't already know. So why do we gather material first? A lot of people, instead of doing this stage, they skip it entirely and they start with organizing the presentation. But it's actually really important to gather material first because sometimes when we start with organization, we still don't know exactly what material we have, what information we know. So when we start with brainstorming, when we start with mind mapping, when we start with research, then we put all of the information that we know, all of the information that we have in the same place. And then when we have it in the same place, we can start to see the patterns. We think, what is this presentation about? What do I have? What can I do with this information? And from there, you go into organizing. So when you organize a presentation, you structure the presentation, you think of the pattern that will lead you through the presentation so that what you are presenting makes sense to your audience. Generally, a presentation starts with an introduction. The introduction includes the introduction to yourself, what's your name, where are you from. It includes the introduction to your topic, and then also your preview. Your preview is, where are we going? What am I going to talk about today? What are my main points? Then you go from there into the body of your presentation. This is where most of your information is. The body is divided into main points, usually 3 or 4, sometimes 2 main points. So your introduction prepares people for the body. The body takes people through all of the information in your presentation, divided into the smaller categories. And then at the end, you go into a conclusion. The conclusion gives a summary of the information. What did we talk about? What was important? And then often it gives people something to think about. It gives people a direction to go. What do they do with the information that you've given them in the presentation? And one really important thing that you need to think about as you are organizing your presentation is the transitions. You cannot forget transitions. This is actually one of the hardest parts, one of the most important parts of a presentation, is going from one section to the other. I start in the introduction, I go through 2 or 3 or 4 main points, and then I go into the conclusion, and they're not separate parts. They all need to be connected together. The transitions are what takes somebody from one part to the next part. It helps my presentation feel like one whole thing. And these are really important. This is kind of a language skill. We'll actually review some transitions in a few videos in the future from now. Not the next video, but the video after that. We'll talk about some language for transitions. But going more specifically into styles of or patterns for organization. So structures, there's a lot of different structures. So you have the general structure, which is introduction, body, conclusion. But organizing the body can take a lot of different forms. So some of the organizational patterns we have include chronological. This is time. Chronological is easy. My chronological pattern is this main point comes first because it came first in time. This main point comes second because it came afterwards. And this main point comes third because it came last. So chronological is time order. You might also organize it spatially. This would be a speech or a presentation about a space or about something, a topic that is different in different places. And then each of my main points is a different place. So that's spatial. Next is something called climactic. This is least to most important. So I start with the main idea or the main point that is the least important. And then my last main point is the point that's the most important. I leave people with that at the end so that they can think about that one most. Another organizational pattern is problem solution. This is a 2-point organizational pattern. My first main point is what's the problem? What does it look like? My second main point is what's the solution? How can I solve that problem? Another organizational pattern is the compare and contrast. This is comparing and contrasting. It can be either 2 main points. So my first main point is these are the comparisons. These are how these things are similar. My second main point is these are how they are different. Or I can do it point by point. That's what's called block style. I can also do it point by point, which I'll give you an example of in a moment. So compare and contrast is one way that I can organize a presentation. I can also do cause and effect. So I'm looking at the cause and effect. This can be I'm thinking of solutions to a problem. It's similar to problem and solution. Or I'm thinking about how the actions of one thing will cause a change in the future. So I can organize that presentation as cause and effect. And the last one is advantages and disadvantages. This is often I'm thinking of whether I should take a certain course of action. I think about why it would be good, why it would be bad. What are the disadvantages of it? What are the advantages of it? What's important is that when I have the material, so I've gathered the material, I look at all of the material that I have, and then I think about what organizational pattern makes the most sense with the material that I have, with the topic that I have, and the purpose. What's the purpose of my presentation? How can I best communicate that information? And it's really important to choose an organizational pattern, because if I choose the organizational pattern and I know that I want to present it in spatially or climactically or chronologically, that will help my audience understand the presentation. If you don't choose an organizational pattern and you just go into the presentation, you might end up making a presentation that's really confusing. And your audience won't be able to understand it. Organizational patterns will actually help you make a presentation that is more impactful, that your audience gets better. You can help your audience by choosing a good organizational pattern. So I'm going to take you through a number of examples of organizational patterns. And we're talking about the topic here. The topic of the presentation that I'm going to make is English. But I'm going to show you how organizational patterns can actually change the presentation. So we're talking about English, right? One example is English language around the world. Well, around the world we're talking about space. So I could easily do a spatial presentation. Talking about English language around the world, first I would start with learning English in Europe. What is English language studying, or the English language classroom work? What does learning English look like in Europe? That's my first main point. My second main point is learning English in China. My third main point is learning English in Thailand. So this is an example of spatial organization. I start in one place, I move to another place, move to a third place. Europe to China to Thailand. But all of these, what I'm going to be talking about there is learning English in that place. So that's how I can organize it spatially. I could also compare and contrast. So for example, I could compare and contrast the English language studying regarding instruction, classroom instruction. What does classroom instruction look like in Thailand? What does classroom instruction look like in Europe? I can compare and contrast those things. How are they similar? How are they different? I could compare and contrast testing in Europe, testing in China, testing in Thailand. How are they similar? How are they different? What does that cause, those differences and similarities? I can also look at homework. How is homework different, assigned differently in Europe, in China, and Thailand? This is an example of point-by-point compare and contrast. So I compare and contrast 3 different subtopics. So I compare and contrast instruction in different places, compare and contrast testing in different places, compare and contrast homework in different places. So this is an example of how I can use a different organizational style to highlight different information based on the material that I've gathered. Let's keep going. We're still talking about English. Now, I want to talk about the history of English. Usually, history will be a chronological presentation. So if I'm talking about the history of English language learning in Thailand, that's a chronological presentation. I start with the beginning of English education in Thailand. This is the first point. It's the first point in time. I'm going back to the very beginning. Then I talk about the development of English education. So first I start at the beginning. I go then to the next, which is how has it changed? How did it change? What were those changes in, where did those changes come from and what did they cause? I can then go on to English teaching today. So I go from the beginning to the middle to today. What does English language look like today? English language learning in Thailand. How has it become better? What are its problems? And then from there, I can keep going into the future. What will English language look like in the future? Where do I think English language learning is going in Thailand? This is an example of a chronological presentation. All of my points are situated chronologically in time. First, second, third, fourth. And that will really help your audience understand. It's a very clear organizational pattern that will help your audience connect to and access the information that you have. Okay, let's keep going. Another example. Now I want to talk about the advantages and disadvantages. So this might be a speech about should English language study be required in school? If I'm talking about that, usually a question about should something be required? Is this a good idea? This is where you will have advantages, disadvantages, organizational style. So should English language study be required in school? I can look at the advantages. Why is it good? How will that help students? Why would requiring English language learning be a good thing for Thailand, for students, for teachers, right? But then I could also look at why is it bad? What are the problems? And I can connect these advantages and disadvantages to each other. And then usually in the conclusion, what I will leave people with is, so what do I think? Do I think it's a good idea? Do I think it's a bad idea? What do I think is the best way forward based on this either or question? So this is an example of a speech or a presentation that would have an advantages, disadvantages, organizational pattern. Let's look at a few more examples. So now I want to talk about the best ways to improve your English skills. This is a different direction for the same topic, right? We're still talking about English, but now we're talking about ways to improve our English. This could be climactic. I could start with the least important, or one of the ways that I think is the least helpful but is still helpful, which would be classroom study. So studying in a classroom is helpful, but self-study, studying on your own, is more helpful, but everyday conversation, talking with people in that language, talking with people in English is the most helpful. So this is an example of climactic organization. I start with classroom study, which is helpful, but not the most helpful. Then I go something that is more helpful, which is self-study. Then I go something which is the most helpful, which is everyday conversation. So I organize it in a way that I'm always leading my audience to the next point. I have a logic to why I have put this point first, this point second, and this point third. And that connects to each other, and then my audience can understand my presentation even better. Another example of ways to improve my English skills, this could be a problem solution. I could talk about if you have a problem speaking, what do I do? How can I solve those problems? What about if I have problems writing? How can I solve the problems that I have with writing English? Or what if I have problems listening? How can I solve those problems? Again, this is problem solution that is a point-by-point organizational structure. What are the problems with speaking? How do I solve them? What are the problems with writing? How do I solve them? What are the problems with listening? How do I solve those? So these are just a lot of examples of how the organizational structure will actually change the direction of your presentation and can help you communicate specific information. Choosing an organizational structure is really important to helping your audience understand what you want to say and why you're saying it. So that's all the information that I have for you about gathering material and organization. These are really important steps to creating a presentation, and sometimes people skip them. So make sure the next time you're doing an oral presentation that you start with your gathering material, finding that information, and you before you go on to actually practicing the speech, that you really organize it and choose what comes first, what comes second, in the most logical pattern that will help your audience, and you'll make a much stronger presentation. I'll see you next time as we talk more about oral presentation.